Hilchos Bikkurim Ushar Matnes Kahuna Shebagvulin Perek Shishi. The laws of the first fruits and other Kohanic gifts that apply in Israel, chapter 6. Today we continue the laws of Challah, the first part of the dough that one must give to the Kohen. The Rambam begins Halacha Aleph Halokeach Min Hanachtoim. If somebody buys bread or dough from a baker, Chayav B'Challah, the customer is obligated to separate challah from the dough. Now yesterday we said that a baker must separate challah from his own dough. So what does it mean you have to take challah from the baker's dough? So the commentaries explain we're talking about a case where for whatever reason the baker didn't take challah. Either he's suspect not to take challah, or he told the customer outright, I didn't take challah, you take challah, or the dough became impure so the baker didn't want to take challah. The point is, in this specific case, the customer has to take challah, and when the customer does, says the Rambam, umafrish min hachama al hatzeinenes u'min hatzeinenes al hachama. You can take challah from hot bread, freshly baked bread, to exempt cold bread, or cold bread onto hot bread. Afilu mitfusin harbe, even from multiple molds. They used to bake bread in different molds to achieve different shapes, and maybe the molds came from different stashes of wheat from different years. Doesn't matter. You can take challah from one to the other. Says the Rambam, a general rule, halacha beis, ein chayavin b'challah ela chamisha min itvua bilvat. You're only obligated to take challah from a dough made from the 5 types of grain. Veheim, which they are, hachitin, wheat, v'hasoirim, barley, v'hakusmin, spelt, v'shibelis shual, and oats, v'hashifin, and rye. Shenemar, because the Torah says, ba'acholchem milechem haaretz. The obligation of challah applies when you eat from the bread of the land. Ve'ein korei lechem ela pas hanases me'elu. Bread, biblically speaking, is only a bread made from one of these 5 species. But if you make bread from rice flour or from millet flour or any other legume, they're not obligated in challah at all. It's not considered a biblical dough. Halacha gimel, haleket, v'hashikha, v'hapeya, the gifts that go to the poor from the field, fallen stalks, forgotten stalks, the corner of the field, v'hahefker, or ownerless wheat, utvua shalei hevi shlish, or grain which hasn't produced a third of its growth, which was anyways exempt from truma and meiser. Afal pishein pturin min truma chayavin b'challah. Even though these scenarios are all exempt from the truma, the other gift to the kohen, 2%, they're obligated in challah. You must give the part of the dough that you make from this gift to the kohen. V'chein, similarly, meiser rishayin shehikdimai b'shibalim. There's a law, after 2% to the kohen, you give 10% to the Levi. What if the Levi came and grabbed his 10th while the grain was still stalks? Before you had a chance to give the 2% to the kohen. He takes his meiser, shenitla trumasay, and he takes the truma from the meiser, the 10% from the 10% which he gives to the kohen. He took that also. Afal pisha yesh by chelek truma gdaila, even though proportionally speaking, there's still a part of the meiser which should have belonged to the kohen. The 2% which you hadn't yet given, we'll soon see, you're going to be obligated in challah in this case. Similarly, umeiser sheni vehekdish shenifdu, if you have second tithe, or any consecrated property which you redeemed onto money, and now the produce is ordinary, so you're also obligated in challah. Umoisar ha'omer, flour left over from the omer offering. Second day of Pesach, they would take barley, cut the new barley, bring it to the temple as a flour offering. But the flour was sifted super fine, so that the original amount which you began with, you only had a little left. And there was always moisar ha'omer, leftover flour from the omer offering. Ushtei halechem, leftover flour from the 2 loaves of bread that were brought in the temple on Shavuot. The lechem hapanim, or the showbread, the weekly bread that was made in the temple. Kishayipadu kol oisana moisar. So if you have leftover flour from all these things and you redeem them, even though they began holy, now they're unholy, now they're ordinary, hakol chayavin b'challah, they're all obligated in challah when you make a dough from those things. Halacha dalid, isa shel meiser sheni b'Yerushalayim. If you have a dough that you made out of grain from meiser sheni, which you brought to Jerusalem, even though meiser sheni is considered to be mamon gavoha, it's God's money, but you brought it to Yerushalayim where you could eat it. The isas shvius, same thing if a dough made from grain that grew in the Shemitah year. Usfeik meduma. Sfeik meduma means a grain where you have a doubt if truma got mixed in. You don't know if truma got mixed in. If truma for sure got mixed in, that's called meduma. It's actually mixed. Here it's sfeik meduma. So since it could be that it's all ordinary produce, chayavin b'challah. In all these 3 scenarios, when you make the dough, you must take challah from that dough. Aval ha-meduma, but if it's actual meduma, in other words, you actually know that in this pile of grain, there's mixed in truma, so since part of it anyways belongs to the kohen, patur min challah. It's exempt from the challah obligation. When you make the dough out of it, you don't take any challah. Halacha hey, challah is toida urikike nazir. The breads that come along with the Thanksgiving offering, and the wafers that come along with the nazir's offering. Literally, divine providence. Yesterday's Torah reading, all about the nazir. When the nazir finishes his term, he has to bring 30 different loaves. And when a person brings a Thanksgiving offering, today when you say Hagomel, in times of the temple, you had to bring a offering. And together with the offering came some bread. So those bread, says the Rambam, ason la'atzmai, if the Jew made them for himself, p'turin min ha'chala, they're exempt from having challah taken from them, because they're holy. They're going to go to the sacrifice, to the altar. You don't have to take challah from them. L'machran bashuk, l'nizirim u'l'makrivei taida. But if you're a baker and you're making these wafers to sell in the market to those people who need to bring them a nazir, or a person who has to bring a Thanksgiving offering, chayavin b'challah. Now you have to take challah before you sell them. Lefisha bedaita, because everybody knows that in your intention is sheim leiti macher yechlena. If you're not going to find customers, what are you going to do? You'll take it back home, have it for dinner. So since you may end up eating it, you must take challah before you bring it to the market. Halacha vav, isas hashutfin, a dough made by partners. That means they jointly owned the dough. Even if they're going to separate it later when it turns into bread. But when it's a dough, they're not separating it. Or if a guy is making a dough for lots of people, it's not hefker, not ownerless, but he has in mind, he's not going to use it, it's for a bunch of people. Chayeves b'challah. Still, it's obligated in challah. You must take challah before you make this dough into bread. Halacha zayin, ha'oise isa min ha'tevel. If somebody makes a dough from tevel, untithed produce, he took nothing from it. Bein shehikdim challah litruma, bein shehikdim truma lechallah. Whether he ends up taking first the challah portion from the dough, and then truma, 2% of the kohen, or he takes 2% of the kohen, as should be done properly, and then takes the challah, masha asa asui, what's done is done, even though he hasn't taken the other tithes. But if he separated the challah first before taking the truma, no eating it until you first take the proper truma and trumas meiser, 10th of a tenth, which will ultimately go to the kohen, because those two cannot be eaten by a non-kohen. If you took truma first, so of course you cannot eat it till you take challah from it, because that's also a requirement to be taken before you eat the dough. Halacha ches. If you make a dough with the full intention to feed it to your animals, you're not planning to eat it humanly, p'tura, it's exempt from challah, because challah only applies to dough that's meant for human consumption. Isas haklavim, the dough that's made for dogs. The Talmud describes this. They used to take basically the whole grain, and they didn't even mix it properly with the water. It became like a very loose type of a dough, meant to be fed to the dogs. But sometimes, says the Rambam, dogs used to eat this stuff. But sometimes, bisman shaharayim oichlin mimena, if it's a time where the shepherds felt comfortable to eat from this dough. Shepherds weren't the most picky eaters, but they would only eat from things that could be eaten by humans. So if the dough was somewhat edible to the point that the shepherd would eat from it, chayeves b'challah, even though it was made for the dogs, but the shepherds eat it, some humans eat it, it's obligated in challah. Isa sa'ivit kechavim p'tura, a dough made by a Gentile is exempt from challah. They don't have the mitzvah. It's only a Jewish mitzvah. What if hayu Yisrael v'ivit kechavim shutfin be'isa? What if you had a partnership of a Jew and a Gentile making a dough together, owning the dough jointly? If when you would theoretically divide it, the amount that's going to the Jew is an amount that itself would be obligated in challah, as we're going to learn today, later on, what that amount is, then the whole dough is obligated in challah. The whole dough. That's how the commentaries explain it, because there's enough for the Jew's part to be obligated in challah. Halacha yud oivid kechavim shehifrish challah. What if a Gentile didn't ask anybody? He separated challah. He comes to you with a dough. Says, here, I have a portion for the kohen. Afilu be'eretz Yisrael, even if it's Israel. So it's like a biblical obligation for Jews. Eina challah. What the guy did is nothing. It's not challah. We let him know, listen, we love you, but we don't need this donation from you. And it could even be eaten by a not kohen, even though the guy put it aside for the kohen. But it's worthless. It can be eaten by a non-kohen. Why don't we worry, maybe it was a Jewish dough, and the Jew didn't want to have to give challah, so he made it as if it belongs to the guy, so he'll be exempt from challah. And maybe the guy is being honest, and he's bringing us challah from a Jewish dough. How do we just push him away like that? Why don't we worry? Maybe there's a Jew playing a trick here. Says the Rambam, if a Jew is playing a trick, he would play a better trick. She'im yirtza Yisrael, if the Jew wanted so much to be exempt from challah, yifter atzmai v'yasa Yisrael isasei pachas mishir challah. He would simply exempt himself by making his dough smaller than the amount which requires challah. Why go through a whole headache of giving it to a goy and then blaming him for owning your dough? Just make your dough smaller than the right amount. And anyways, you don't have to give challah. No one's going to chase you down. So therefore, there's no reason to worry that a Jew would hand off his dough to the goy. Halacha Yud Aleph, hama'arev kermach chitim v'kemach oires. If somebody mixes wheat flour and rice flour, the asa mehen isa, and he creates a dough. Says the Rambam, im yesh bo tam dagon chayeves b'chala. If, when you taste it, it tastes like wheat, like the grain, it's obligated in challah. V'im lav petura. If not, it's exempt. How are you going to taste it? If you didn't take challah, you can't taste it. Right? So two things. Either it's talking about outside of Israel, where you're allowed to eat the dough and then take the challah later, like we said yesterday. Or it's a scenario where you'll have a goy taste it. Somebody who's not going to be chayav in the obligation of challah. Or maybe a Kohen. Kohen could eat it. Afilu haya ha'sa'ir chitim. L'soich isas oirez. Even if it's not wheat flour and rice flour. What if it's just yeast from wheat? Right? They used to make dough and then let it become sourdough, and then the sourdough would become yeast for other doughs. So if it was a sourdough yeast from wheat, and you're putting it into a full rice dough, im yesh ba tam dagan chayeves b'challah. If it has the taste of wheat, the whole dough is obligated in challah, because yeast is considered to be a very integral part to the dough. V'im lav petura. If not, then it's exempt. Halacha Yud Bey says that Rambam a whole bunch of scenarios that are going to be obligated in challah. Isa shani leisha b'yayin oy shemen oy dvash oy mayim reischim. A dough that was kneaded not with water, just with wine, with oil, or with honey, or boiling water, which would seem to mix less with the wheat, with the flour. Or you put spices into the dough. Or you boiled up like a pan of water, and then you threw in the flour, and then kneaded it automatically with the hot water, and it became a dough in this funny way. Im afa'a, if you ended up baking such a mixture, bein betanor, bein bekarka, bein alamachavas v'amarcheshes, whether you did it in an oven, or on the ground, or in a deep pan, or in a shallow pan, bein shehidbik es habatzek, b'machavas u'v'amarcheshes, v'achar kach hirtichon ba'esh milamata, whether you first stuck the dough to the pan, and then you heated them up with fire under it, ad shenefes hapas, till the bread baked, bein shehir ticha v'achar kach hidbik habatzek, or you heated it up first, and then you put the dough in. Kol elu chayav in challah. In all these scenarios, you're obligated in challah. Challah doesn't have to be a dough of flour and water, like matzah, let's say, right? It has to be flour and water. Challah, even if you bake pizza that's a mezainas pizza, which just has other liquids, you're obligated to take challah first from that dough. But if you make a dough just to dry it in the sun, you're not planning to use any heating elements besides for the sun to bake it, or you want to cook it in a pot with water. It's not a Dutch oven. Today they have a Dutch oven, right? There's those pots that you cook bread in, but there's no water there. Here he's talking about with water. Harehi ptura mina challah. These cases are exempt from challah. She'ein ma'aseh chama lechem, because the products of the sun are not considered to be bread. Bein shalasha b'mayim, bein shalasha b'shar mashkin. Doesn't matter if you mixed it with water or other liquids. No matter. From the sun, it's not obligated. V'chein kali, also toasted grain or roasted grain. Shalashin oisa b'mayim, oy bidvash, v'oichlin oisa b'lei afiyah. You knead it with water or with honey, and then you eat it with no baking. Just have the grain with the water. Potter, it's exempt. She'ein chayeves elo isa shesoifa lehe'ofes lechem l'may chaladam. The only thing obligated in challah is a dough, A. B, it's baked into bread. C, for human consumption. It's got to meet all those three conditions. A dough that's baked for humans is chayav in challah. If it's not missing one of those, it's exempt. Halacha Yud Gimel. Isa shalasha tchila la'aseisa ma'aseh chama v'hishlima la'aseis pas. A person bakes a dough, he needs a dough, to begin with. In his mind, he wants to make it in the sun. Then when he finishes the dough, he's like, you know what, I'm actually making it into regular bread. You began with the intent to make it bread, then you finished it with the intent to make it in the sun. Or roasted grain which you intended to use as bread. These are all obligated in challah, as long as at one point, at one stage in the preparation, you had in mind for regular dough, regular baking bread, you're obligated. Halacha yudalet. Lechem ha'osui lekutach. If you make bread for a dip, they used to have a famous dip called the kutach dip. Not sure it would fly today, but it was made out of moldy milk. They used to use moldy milk with salt and breadcrumbs. Yeah. It was like a sour thing, yeah. Used as a dip.
It's moldy now? Native Africans used to drink sour milk. They would leave it out in the sun. Let it go sour.
There you have it. So they had this dip. In Babylonia, it was considered a very important dip. And you used to make bread to put into this dip. So the question is, here you have bread that you're not really making for bread. You're baking it as bread, but you don't want it for bread. You want it to end up in your dip. So the Rambam says, the way it's made will prove to you what your real intention is. If you made them into rolls, you braided them into proper rolls, chayeves bechala. So I don't care that later on you're going to turn it into breadcrumbs. Right now, you made it into a roll. It's obligated in challah. Asa kalimudin. If you only made it into strips, just you're going to bake it and then cut it, cut it down like a breadstick. Put them in a challah. Now you're exempt from challah because clearly your only intention is to get it to be baked to put into your dip. So the commentaries in Shulchan Aruch talk about this halacha also for breadcrumbs. Today you buy in the market breadcrumbs. So you have to take challah from a dough that you make for breadcrumbs because it's only ending up for your salad. So there's different opinions on that.
Well, if you wanted to bread schnitzel,
Huh?
like schnitzel.
For schnitzel, exactly.
That comes from wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Bread. Just draw it out and...
Yeah. Some breadcrumb bags, actually, in Israel, I saw them for sure. I don't know if I have them here, but they'll actually say on them, no, it's like it was baked only for this. Like they're going to write that. It was baked just for this. So, therefore the brachas mezainis, according to some opinions, or whatever it is. Okay. Halacha tezvav, kama shiur ha'isa shechayeves bechala. What's the amount of dough? How much dough do you have to make to take challah? So here, the Rambam first gives us the Torah version. Miloi ha'omer kemach. An omer amount of flour. It says in the Torah that every Jew used to get 1 omer of dough, of man, every day in the desert. So since Torah says you have to give challah from the beginning of your dough, and how much man did they get? 1 omer. So the Talmud derives, from here we see you only have to take challah from a dough which has an omer of flour. Now, we'll soon see how much that is. Whether it's a dough made from one species of the 5, or from all 5 species together. Kulam mitztarfin lashir. They can all combine. As long as the total amount is an omer of flour, you must take challah from this dough. V'kamahu shir omer. Okay, how much is an omer? Shnei kabin poches chomesh. 2 kav minus 1/5 of a kav. So we call that 1 4/5 kav. How much is a kav? The hakav arba lugin. So the Rambam says, look at the top line over here. A kav, every kav is 4 lug. The halug arba revi'iyos. Every lug has 4 revi'is. The harevi'is etzba'ayim al etzba'ayim, berum etzba'ayim v'chatzi etzba v'chomesh etzba. The revi'is, the way we measure it is 2 finger breadths by 2 finger breadths by the height of 2 and 1/2 and 1/5 finger breadths. It's called 2.7. Okay, 2.7 finger breadths. So if you knew how big is a finger breadth, you did 2 by 2 by 2.7. The volume that fits in there, that's an omer. I mean, that's 1 revi'is, meaning. One revi'is is 2 by 2 by 2.7. So to get to 1 4/5 kav, you have to do it proportionally, keep adding that amount. So the Rambam says, every finger breadth is the width of the thumb, the widest part of the thumb. So if you follow this mathematical equation of 2 by 2 by 2.7, and you multiply it by about 28.5 to get to the 1 4/5 kavs. So the Rambam says, it turns out that you're going to learn shahamida sheyeshba. Eser etzbois al eser etzbois. Birum sholish etzbois uchia etzba bekeruv hu ha'omer. A measurement of 10 finger breaths, by 10 finger breaths, at a height of 3 1/9, just call it 3.11 finger breaths, approximately hu ha'omer. That's the omer. That's how much flour you have to have in your dough, 10 by 10 by 3.11.
But you go just by the size?
Yes, volume.
Because we have the specific weight for different materials. It
I'll
doesn't matter.
I'll soon tell you about converting it into weight. The Rambam speaks in volume. Torah speaks in volume. The chen, so too, if you want to convert it to a cube, mida sheyesh ba sheva etzbois poches shnei tshiyei etzba. Al sheva etzbois poches shnei tshiyei etzba. Berum sheva etzbois poches shnei tshiyei etzba. Hi mida seimer. Cubically speaking, it's a box that has 7 minus 2/7, which is 6.77 by 6.77 by 6.77 finger breaths. Hi mida seimer. That's the cubical omer. Both boxes that you see over here, 10 by 10 by 3.11, 6.77 cubed, is all the same thing. How much volume does this measurement hold? 43 1/5 eggs, average egg sizes. They are, now that Rambam converts them to weight for his time, mishkal, shisho shmeinim sloim, ushnei shlishe sela, mikemach hachitim shebemitzrayim. Egyptian wheat flour, if you weigh it, it's 86 2/3 coins worth of Egyptian wheat flour. Sheheim mishkal chamesh me'es ve'esr mizuzim mitzrayim is manazeh. Nowadays, it will be 520 Egyptian zuzim, which they were familiar with. That's the standard.
Whichever is the
Yes.
specific weight.
The weight that holds this amount of weight from wheat flour, basically using whatever equation you want, the volume of 6.77 or 86 2/3 of Egyptian wheat, or 520 Egyptian zuzim. That's what we use to measure for challah in all places. Today speaking, Shuri Torah, Rabbi Chaim Noah writes that if you want to be absolutely sure, so if you have 3 pounds, 10 1/4 ounces of flour in your dough, you have to make a bracha. That's like biblical challah. Once you have 2 pounds and 10 ounces of flour, you already must separate challah at least without a bracha. That's what we're talking about. In Israel, they say 2.2 kilos. 2.2 kilos of flour, you make a bracha. Anyway, that's the amount of dough that has to be there for challah. Halacha tazayin asur la'adam la'aseis isasei paches mikashir k'dei lepatra min hachallah. It's forbidden for a Jew to make his dough in groups of less than that amount that's required, just to exempt it from challah. And the commentaries say, if you're not doing it to exempt it from challah, let's say you're just 2 people in the house, you're making a small dough because you're a small family, that's fine. As long as you're not doing it with the intent to be rid of the obligation of challah. But if you did it with the intent, it's forbidden. If you separate challah from a dough which is less than the proper amount, you've done nothing. It's ordinary produce as it used to be. But what if you did the following? You bake the bread less than the amount, and then you put it into a basket. You make another loaf of bread, put it into the basket. And in the end of the day, if in the basket you now have a bunch of breads that equal to the amount of challah, hasal mitzar from the challah, the basket combines them for the obligation, umafrish challah min apas, and you must separate challah from the bread. Shenemar, because it says, v'haya ba'acholchem milechem ha'aretz. Torah says, when you eat from the bread of the land. That means melamed teaches you, shehu mafrish min ha'afri. There could be a scenario where you'll separate challah from bread that's baked already. Ve'ein hatamer mitzar from the challah. Only a basket, not the oven. The oven doesn't combine them to challah. Just because you have a bunch of doughs in the oven baking at once doesn't combine them. Halacha yudzayin hayu hakikarois noishchay zu bezu. You ever see this in the oven? Bake a bunch of breads, and before you know it, all the breads are biting into each other. They're like all joined up. So if the loaves bit into each other, then yiskabitz min hakol shir chalam. And now, from everything together, you have the amount of challah, chayavin bechallah, afal pisha einan basal. Right now, even if they're on a pan, flat pan, they're all obligated in challah, even if they're not in a basket. Afa ma'at ma'at, v'kibetz hakoil al luach she'ein loy toich. What if you baked little by little bread, and you gathered it all together on a board, not in a basket, it doesn't have a cavity, it doesn't have an inside. Harei safek, you're in doubt. And what do we do with the doubt? If it's a rabbinic challah, you're not going to be obligated to separate challah unless what's combining it is a receptacle with a cavity. If it's biblical, and even on a board, you should take biblical challah. But if it's only rabbinic, wait till it has a cavity. You have flour which you didn't sift. You only kneaded it with its bran, like a whole grain type of a thing. So long as the entire flour that you're using right now has the amount of an omer, you're obligated in challah. But if you originally sifted the dough, took away the bran from the flour, and then you put back the bran, and now there's an amount of an omer, it's not obligated, because when you sifted it first, you revealed your intention, you don't want the bran. Now you're putting it back in, the bran doesn't count. Halacha Yutes, Nachtem Shasa Isala Sesa If a baker was making a big dough to turn into sourdough, to give it out to become yeast. Chayeves bechala, they're all obligated in challah. Shem Leiti Mocher Yasena Pas, because the baker knows if I don't sell it, I'm going to make it into regular bread. But if you make a dough to split it up as dough, not for sourdough or yeast, ptura, then it's exempt because you're going to give it out in smaller amounts than the proper shear. Halacha Chaf, Nashim Shenasnu Kemach Lenachtoim, Lases Lahem Sa'er. What if local women came with flour to the baker and they want him to make sourdough for them? In Ein B'Shal Achas Me'an Kashir. If neither individual unit of women's flour has the proper amount, Afal Pisha Yesh Bichlalan Kashir, even if together they all have the proper amount, Ptura, they're exempt because each woman counts for herself. Nevertheless, by the way, the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch writes that if all the women agree to have their dough baked into one big dough before they split it up, they have to take challah. Because once everyone agrees to become one dough, then there's the amount of flour for challah, so you must take challah from it.